Tau. In Alzheimer's, tau is the lesser talked about but still vitally important partner in crime to amyloid beta. Both molecules contribute to the plaque buildup in the brain that is thought to cause Alzheimer's. However, in my past few Alzheimer's videos, I've tended to talk a lot more about amyloid beta and not as much about tau, and there's a few good reasons for that. For starters, this has to do with my own personal bias. My research has mainly focused on amyloid treatments for Alzheimer's and not tau. But it's not just me who's been putting amyloid ahead of tau. The whole pharmaceutical world has also been entranced with amyloid. I mean, in the past few years, we've seen the approval of several amyloid therapies, and amyloid therapies only seem to be gaining speed to becoming the new standard of care for treating Alzheimer's. From the amyloid-targeting lecanemab to the now-defunct aducanumab, amyloid has been hogging the headlines. So why is tau in the background, and is that something we should change? I'm going to talk about everything tau in this video, so stick around. To understand how tau got its place as secondary to amyloid or A-beta, we have to go back, way back to when Alois Alzheimer's first characterized the disease. He was a clinical psychiatrist who had been studying what he called a particular severe disease process of the cerebral cortex, a disease where patients slowly lose their memory, affecting their mood, sleep, and ability to live independently. As a psychiatrist in the 1900s, he would do what most modern-day psychiatrists do not have to do, which is perform a rather ruleless autopsy on his patient's brain after they die. Pretty wild, but there were a lot less regulations back then. So, looking under the microscope at his patient's brains, he noted large clumps interspersed between neurons. They took on irregular but mostly circular shapes and were a little bigger than the neuron's cell body. They were all over, spread throughout the cerebral cortex, and these clumps, which he called plaques, seemed to take over the brain. Now, in one patient, this is strange and interesting, but not enough to characterize the disease, so he didn't just look in one patient. Over the years, he observed these plaques in multiple patients and found that the plaques are consistently associated with his disease of the cerebral cortex. He recorded all his data and eventually published his findings in a book in 1910 where he described the pathology of Alzheimer's. Well, it wasn't actually called Alzheimer's yet. A fellow scientist proposed the name Alzheimer's to describe the fascinating condition, and there we had the first written record of Alzheimer's, characterized by plaques in the brain. This was pretty exciting. To be able to attach a mental disease with its molecular pathology was not all that common for the time. It's hard to find the cause of disease, and especially one that occurs in the brain. These disorders of affect typically don't have easily traceable molecules. No virus, no bacteria. Even today, we are still in the dark about the cause of many illnesses that affect the brain. So this is a really exciting discovery and also paves the way for a cure. We know that there's plaques in the brain, so get rid of the plaques, we get rid of the disease. But despite this exciting discovery linking those plaques to a certain disease, the news of Alzheimer's sort of went under the radar. People didn't live as long back then, and the disease was relatively rare. So for almost 50 years, Alzheimer's was forgotten, sitting on a shelf in an unopened medical book. It wasn't until after World War II, when people started living longer, that the interest in Alzheimer's started back up again. In the post-war boom, people were living longer thanks to huge advancements in health and medicine, not to mention a lack of a world war. Neurodegenerative diseases associated with aging suddenly resurged into existence, and they did so at a time when biological sciences was also exploding, and more specifically, genetics. Sure, there were general advancements in science and medicine, the PET scan in the 60s and the MRI in the 70s, but genetics quickly was becoming the star of the show. The 1960s saw the discovery of the 4 base codes that make up DNA, A, C, G, and T. This crucial discovery, along with several others, paved the path for a paradigm-shifting boom of innovation in the 70s. To list a few, the 70s saw the harnessing of recombinant DNA, which allowed us to essentially make our own genetic code, the invention of the PCR, which allowed us to better study DNA, and the invention of the Sanger sequencing technique, which allowed us to eventually complete the Human Genome Project. From this point on, we finally began speaking the language of the body. With these huge improvements to the field of genetics, we gained this understanding that the human body is truly and ubiquitously governed by genes, from your cells to your organs to literally everything about you. If you want to know what's going on, look at your genes. And if you want to change what's going on, change your genes. The 70s also saw the founding of the first ever genetic engineering company. Yes, it was back in 76 when we began using genetic modifications in medicine, which is a story all its own, but goes to show that the scientific community was changing rapidly at the time. DNA and genetic engineering became the heart and soul of biological medicine, and I would argue still is. So now that we have some historical context, let's get back to why tau is less studied than amyloid. In 1987, the APP gene was discovered. APP stands for amyloid precursor protein, and it's the gene that codes for amyloid beta, the very molecule which makes up the plaques that Alois had described back in the early 1900s. And this very quickly entranced scientists with the idea that APP is the genetic cause of Alzheimer's disease. An interesting aside, we discovered the APP gene by chance, actually through studying Down syndrome. If you didn't know, Down syndrome is a disorder of trisomy of chromosome 21. So people with Down syndrome have an extra copy of chromosome 21, and people with Down syndrome also almost always develop Alzheimer's disease. So scientists reason that the gene associated with Alzheimer's must be related to chromosome 21, and they essentially traced back the amyloid protein to its origin on that chromosome. But back to the main story. Now we had a gene that causes Alzheimer's, and in a time when genetic research was all the rage, APP really exploded in the scientific community. There was a huge spike in research about the APP gene and its downstream effects, and the idea that APP mutations cause Alzheimer's emerged as the prevailing hypothesis for the cause of Alzheimer's. This is called the amyloid hypothesis, which is still widely talked about today. I actually have a few videos about it, but you can watch those after you're done watching this one. The amyloid hypothesis reigned for many reasons, but I believe one reason is because it's simple. We are often told in science that the explanation with the least amount of assumptions is the most probable, meaning the gaps between data where we're left to draw conclusions should be as small as possible. We shouldn't make too many assumptions and overcomplicate any explanation, especially when a simple explanation will sufficiently explain the same thing. So the amyloid hypothesis fits with this because it's straightforward. A gene impacts a protein, impacts the body. We don't make assumptions about hidden risk factor or secondary causes. It's the APP gene. Another reason why amyloid hypothesis took off is because of genetics. Scientists love genetics, and genetics was really trending at the time. The amyloid hypothesis supports this concept that all things can be traced back to genes very nicely. So APP, and therefore amyloid, causing Alzheimer's is an easy win in history. It's clear, it's easy to understand, and relies on the genetics that scientists know and love. Now, for those of you who know me or watch more of my videos, I probably sound like a broken record right now. This girl talking about amyloid hypothesis again. But stay with me because it's crucial to the story of tau. See, it's hard to focus on other things when you have something so clear and easy to understand right in front of you. The amyloid hypothesis grabbed the imagination of scientists, and those studying Alzheimer's had their new target. No one had any interest in searching for a second molecule when they had the cure to Alzheimer's right in front of them. All they had to do was figure out how to fix either the APP gene or the amyloid proteins it creates, and they would solve Alzheimer's. So, while amyloid was capturing the hearts of scientists, what was tau doing? Let's go back, and I have to admit something. In the beginning, when I talked about Alois discovering amyloid, I left something out. I left that he also discovered tau. He saw these clumps, unique from the amyloid clumps, occurring inside the neuron all over the brain instead of between the neurons. This was tau, clumping inside of neurons in the form of neurofibrillary tangles. He obviously didn't know that it was tau at the time, and he wouldn't know that for many years, but it was always right there, next to amyloid. Not hiding. I mean, you can see it in a 20th century microscope. So why didn't tau get picked up like amyloid did? Well, the answer, I think, really ties into this genetic frenzy of the 20th century. Before the war ended, right before Alzheimer's jumped into public consciousness again, both amyloid and tau had relatively equal opportunities to become the star of the show, but only one made it to fame. The one with the simple story, the one with the sellable and comprehensible genetic lineage. Tau, on the other hand, is complicated, and honestly, we discovered it a little too late. We didn't even discover the connection between molecular tau and Alzheimer's until the late 80s, right around the time when the amyloid precursor gene was discovered. By the time we realized that tau is the molecule that makes up those intraneuronal plaques, we had already begun forming the amyloid hypothesis. Then, in the early 90s, fully after the amyloid hypothesis had been established, we finally discovered the gene for tau called MAPT. When we discovered the gene for tau, it wasn't even in association with Alzheimer's. We discovered it because we thought it was causing a whole other neurodegenerative disease called frontotemporal dementia, or FTD. We went on to discover a whole slew of what we call taupathies, or neurodegenerative diseases that experience abnormal tau buildup. Tau can't be the core of Alzheimer's if it's already the cause of other diseases. What's more, there's no straightforward genetic relationship between tau and Alzheimer's. MAPT mutations don't directly cause tau mutations in Alzheimer's as you see with the amyloid and APP gene. Instead, alternative splicing of the MAPT gene lead to different versions of tau, which are not necessarily deadly on their own, but are perhaps lethal in specific ratios of one isoform to another. So different versions of a protein coded from the same gene in a specific ratio are what make tau dangerous. And that doesn't fit with our one-to-one understanding of genetic mutations and disease. So for the time being, tau was a side character, an interesting one, but still a side character at best. Now, in modern genetics, we understand things with a bit more nuance. Our understanding of the world grows with more evidence, and that is normal and good. Today, we know that genes are not just one-to-one with a disease. Sometimes multiple genes cause the same disease, and sometimes multiple diseases come from the same gene. But in the early days of genetic research, there was this push to find the gene associated with every disease. The scientific community latched onto this idea that the APP gene mutation caused amyloid abnormalities, which eventually caused Alzheimer's. So, with amyloid taking the lead in Alzheimer's research, scientists developed advanced methodologies for studying amyloid, creating sort of a positive feedback loop reinforcing amyloid. They invented techniques to study amyloid, which led to more studying of amyloid, which led to more innovation. And you can see how this cycle repeats upon itself. The best example of this is the A-beta PET scan, a tool designed to detect amyloid in living patients and something we still use today for diagnosis of Alzheimer's. Scientists were interested in A-beta, so they made technologies to study A-beta, so they studied A-beta more. Nowadays, amyloid and the amyloid hypothesis is inevitably tied with Alzheimer's. With decades of research and evidence to stand on, the amyloid hypothesis dominates Alzheimer's research, leading to large-scale investments in understanding, diagnosis, and treatment. Amyloid therapy is a large and lucrative business nowadays. And yet, we have no cure. The past few years have seen the approval of several Alzheimer's drugs, all of them having to do with amyloid. But if APP mutations alone was the core cause of Alzheimer's, quite frankly, we would have been on our way to a cure by now. Now, I'm not here to argue the validity of the amyloid hypothesis. I've already talked about that issue, but just to say that there's more to the picture. Tau, the often forgotten sibling of amyloid, has just as much to do with Alzheimer's as amyloid does. So, up until now, I've talked mainly about how tau was just behind in terms of time we spent researching it, and that's what led to it being behind now. But I also want to give more weight to the fact that tau is just more complicated. Plain and simple, tau is too complicated for it to have caught on as quickly, and quite frankly, it's going to need more time and research than amyloid needs. For starters, we have the genetics and the alternative splicing that I talked about earlier, but it's also more complicated on a structural level. Tau is not homogeneous, meaning it's not composed of the same repeating structure. Instead, it's composed of a variety of slightly altered versions of hyperphosphorylated tau, making it highly heterogeneous. This makes tau a moving target. With different versions from different people and even throughout different regions of the brain, it's not the same molecule repeating, it's more complicated than that. And finally, it's literally tangled in the neurons. We call tau plaques neurofibrillary tangles because they're tangled in the inner workings of the inside of neurons. Getting tangled with neurons essentially ruins the cell. It breaks it apart from the inside. And getting that out seems to be impossible, and honestly, it's more likely that future treatment will focus on prevention rather than getting it out. We're not at a point in science where we can repair broken neurons. Once they're broken by tau, they are likely going to stay that way. It's more likely that treatments will have to focus on preventing tau, which is made even more complicated by the fact that tau accumulation happens before any other symptoms in Alzheimer's, even before cognitive decline and before amyloid pathology. So it's a race to detect tau and also prevent it before it can break down those neurons. Tau is then genetically, morphologically, and pathologically more complicated than amyloid. Not only is tau research behind, but it's more complicated and will need more time and research than amyloid needed. So I hope by now we sort of have an understanding of why amyloid came to take center stage. In a sentence summary, amyloid was first to the scene and provided a way easier explanation than tau. Today, our understanding of genetics is more nuanced, and we understand that to treat Alzheimer's, we need to treat the multiplicities of things that go wrong in the brain, not just the amyloid plaques. And thankfully, people have realized that. After decades of focusing on amyloid, tau is gaining traction. The Alzheimer's Association and related organizations are putting more funding into understanding tau, and we are trying to understand which biomarkers we can use to study tau at those early time points before you get cognitive decline. We are discovering how to intervene in those early stages before tau accumulation. Eli Lilly has developed a tau PET scan to accompany the amyloid imaging, which already existed, and many pharmaceutical companies are developing tau therapies. I am actually working on one of them. Now, these therapies are behind, none have made it out of clinic, but they eventually will. And when we finally target tau and amyloid together, we will be one step closer to curing Alzheimer's. So maybe it's time the public starts focusing a little more on tau. It's a little more complicated, but maybe it's time we give weight to both types of plaques that he saw under the microscope so many years ago. But what do you think? Are there other factors that you think led to tau being left behind? A lot of this video essay contains conclusions I've drawn myself using facts about the history of research, so I'm obviously open to hearing what other people think may have contributed to the dominance of amyloid in science and medicine. As always, thank you so much for watching. Goodbye. So why is tau in the background? And is that something we should change?